We're live on Facebook.
Great.
Here they come.
You want to sit together?
A few more joining us.
Casey, can we mute everyone?
Yep.
Thank you.
Nate, don't scream.
Not everyone is muted here.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Thursdays with the Starr Center. My name's Casey Stewart. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Experiential Learning here at the Starr Center. Welcome. If this is your first time, thanks for joining us. If you've been with us before, welcome back. We're really glad to have you. I just want to go over a few things before we get started. So first of all, as maybe you've already noticed, we'd like you to please remain muted during the course of this event. That helps all of us to be able to hear better, really enhances the experience. But that's not to say that we don't want to hear from you. We absolutely want you to join the conversation, and you can do so by using the chat function, or you can also raise your hand. And when you do that, our Starr Center Director, Adam Goodhart, will bring you in. So I'd like to introduce Adam Goodhart, our Starr Center Director. He will be having a conversation with Steve Kornacki for tonight's event.
Reviewable.
Enjoy.
Thanks, Casey. And hello and welcome, everyone. I'm coming to you live from Washington College here in Chestertown's famous Colonial Custom House. So I'd like to wish you all a happy April Fool's Day. And guess what? It is no joke. We really do have the one and only Steve Kornacki joining us for this week's special edition of Thursdays with the Starr Center. And we couldn't be more excited to have Steve here with all of us. This program is actually part of Washington College's Harwood Lectures in American Journalism and Politics. It's a series that was established by the family of another distinguished journalist, the late Richard Harwood, a reporter and editor for the Washington Post, including by Richard's journalistic son, John Harwood, who's now, as you probably know, of CNN. The Harwood series is co-sponsored by Washington College's Rose O'Neill Literary House. And I'd like to give a really big special shout out and thanks to my friend, my colleague, and co-curator of this series, the Lit House's director, James Allen Hall, and also to the program in Communications and Media Studies at Washington College for co-sponsoring. There's one final person who deserves really big thanks this evening, and his name is Jack Borer. For those of you who don't know Jack, in addition to being Steve Kornacki's longtime colleague at MSNBC, and he's currently executive producer of The 11th Hour with Brian Williams, Jack is a 2006 alumnus of Washington College. And he actually, we're really proud that he cut his teeth as a writer, as it were, right here in the Custom House, the home of the Starr Center, as a student intern and student fellow, working on his senior thesis in a room right above my head on the third floor of the Custom House. And his thesis later grew into his first book, a wonderful book on Robert Kennedy. So it's through Jack's good graces that we have Steve with us this evening. Jack, thank you so much. And we are so proud of you and the work that you do, all of us at Washington College. So if you are already here with us, Steve Kornacki probably requires little introduction. In fact, he probably requires little introduction for anyone who hasn't been living under a rock for the past 6 months. In addition to his work for almost a decade as a national political correspondent for MSNBC and NBC, he's actually recently started appearing on Monday Night Football as a commenter, not as a player, by the way. And of course, his work during the week of the 2020 presidential election quickly achieved iconic status. And in addition, it secured Steve the distinction of landing as number 13 on People magazine's annual list of the sexiest men alive. I think this might be the first time in Starr Center history that we've had even one of the sexiest men alive. as a guest of the Starr Center, let alone number 13. Talk about exciting. But tonight we're going to start by talking not so much about Steve's career as a TV journalist or even his career as a famously sexy man, but rather his perhaps lesser known to many people, but equally impressive work as a historian, namely his book, The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism. It really is just a fantastic piece of narrative history that goes a long way to describing and explaining where our nation and our politics are today. And if anything, since its original publication in 2018, it's come to be even more relevant than now. So welcome, Steve. We're so glad to have you here and to talk about your book and your other work. So I figured we can talk about your book for a while, and then I've also got some questions that might kind of segue from that about your work as a journalist and political commentator, and then we'll start bringing other folks into the conversation as well. So welcome, and yeah, wow, fantastic book. It's great. You write like a dream.
Thank you, Adam. That's really kind of you. I appreciate that, and thank you everybody, for being part of this. And I did just that People magazine thing. The only thing I would say is that is proof that vote fraud is real, because that could be the only explanation for me landing on that list.
So Steve, I did have one other question for you first, which is that I understand this is not your first time in Chestertown. Well, first of all, you were not in Chestertown except for virtually. You're actually coming to us from 30 Rock, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm at, this is 30 Rock, where NBC News is based. Obviously, I'm not in the studio right now, but I'm in an office in the building. It's very quiet around here right now. But before, in the pre-coronavirus times, I did. You mentioned Jack. He got me down to Chestertown about a year and a half ago, summer of 2019. It was not during the school year, so I saw the campus. It was about as empty then as this building is right now. But wow, what a great area! I was just really impressed with the town, with the campus that I saw, and just the area in general. So you guys down there, I think, picked a pretty good place to live.
Yeah, Jack tells me that you guys had crabs at Waterman's and beers at the Bluebird. And so for those of you who are in Chestertown, that definitely makes Steve already an honorary citizen of Chestertown. So we're glad to have you back. So your book, the story that you tell is both simple and complicated. It's the story of the kind of the arc of the political culture of the 1990s. And I wonder if you could just sort of start things off by giving us a recap of the story that you tell there.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's the title, The Red and the Blue. We went back and forth on all sorts of different possibilities, and then we kind of realized it was staring us in the face, because those colors, red and blue, as political, as partisan colors, red America, red states, blue states. That's the legacy of the 1990s. It is, when I tell people this now, it's folks who lived through it, have forgotten in many cases, and folks who didn't live through it are shocked to find out. There was no such thing well into the 1990s as red America, blue America. If you had used the term a red state in the mid 90s, people would have had no idea what you're talking about. It used to be, from the advent of color television, when election nights came around, the networks would randomly decide, for their own reasons, well, tonight we're going to make the Democratic states turn blue. We're going to make the Republican states turn red. Sometimes they would make the Democratic states red. Sometimes they would make the Republican states blue. One year they used yellow. The colors were completely randomly assigned. And it just so happened that in the 2000 election, it was George W. Bush and Al Gore, it just so happened that night, every network had synced up on the same scheme. It was going to be blue for the Democrats and it was red for the Republicans. And that was the election. It was basically the closest thing to a perfect tie we've ever seen in this country. And it wasn't just that came down to those 537 disputed ballots in Florida. the 6-week recount, the Supreme Court ruling, the nation held in suspense. When you looked at that map, you really saw the story of a division that had taken hold in the country. It was geographic. The entire South, was red. Democrats had, in the old days, the South had been the solid South for Democrats, and Democrats with Bill Clinton and even Al Gore from Tennessee, came into the 90s with the thought of, hey, we can still win the South back. Election night 2000, it was just wall to wall red in the South. The Northeast, a bastion of blue. The Pacific Coast, a bastion of blue. Illinois, Chicago area, the metro areas in the Midwest, increasingly Democratic, and the core kind of interior of the country, red. That was what had sort of taken hold in the course of the 1990s. And there have been some changes, some demographic evolution since then. But that basic divide, it's geographic, it's cultural, it's demographic. The basic divide that went into that red-blue state scheme in 2000 has now been with us for a generation. And I think it's really kind of taken hold deeper. And that's when, I put the term tribalism, in the title. When you take a poll right now and ask people, hey, Democrat, would you be upset if your son or daughter married a Republican? And the polling now is going to be 60%. Or, hey, Republican, would you be upset if your son, daughter married a Democrat? It's going to be 60% plus. Those are numbers you used to get a couple generations ago with something like interracial dating. Partisanship is that deeply held and deeply felt by people. And it wasn't true a generation ago. But so the book is about how the divide was kind of, I think, set into place by the events of the 1990s. I think we've been living with it and dealing with it, and it's been building in many ways since then. But what the book tries to tell is how the specific events of the 1990s, and that is mainly a clash between Bill Clinton, Democratic president, who did in 1992 what many thought was impossible. He got elected president. You came into the 90s, and there was this sense the Republican Party had a lock on the White House. Bill Clinton broke that Republican lock on the White House, and it was a clash between him and Newt Gingrich, the Republican Speaker of the House for the middle part of the 1990s. And Gingrich achieved what was also thought to be impossible at the start of the 90s, and that was he broke the Democratic lock on the House of Representatives. They called it the Permanent Democratic Congress. And it was 40 straight years, 1954 to 1994, that the Democrats were the majority party in the House, and it wasn't even close. I mean, the majorities that Democrats had, it wasn't like, right now you take a look at the Democratic majority. If a few seats slip for them in the 2022 midterms, Democrats are going to lose the House. For decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, for decades, their majority was 50 seats. It was 60 seats. It was 70s. It was an enormous majority. Gingrich broke that dramatically, suddenly in 1994. And the clash between Gingrich and Clinton, between those two parties, Republican Party led by Gingrich, Democratic Party led by Clinton, that is what set that divide in place. It produced that near perfect tie in 2000. It produced that red-blue divide, and that we have been living with, and in some ways, I think, kind of flummoxed by for a generation.
And you tell the story so well and so grippingly, in part because I think a lot of us, especially in the wake of the election coverage you did, are used to seeing you kind of as a numbers guy. And this book really brings you out as a storytelling guy and as a character guy. So you kind of develop the story around these two characters of Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, whom you kind of take as avatars, not just of the politics of their own time, but maybe the politics of the 20 years that have followed since the end of your story. And I wonder if you could talk about each of those colorful and memorable men and the way that they kind of do epitomize the politics that you describe.
Yeah, no, and thank you again. I really appreciate you saying that. I was fascinated with Bill Clinton. And obviously I had known the basic sort of, arc of the Newt Gingrich story before I went into this book, but I found the Gingrich research to be particularly interesting when you really go back to his days before he got to the House. He got to the House, Gingrich did, back in 1978 on his third try. And if he had lost in 78, he would have lost 74, 76, 78. He was an untenured professor at West Georgia College. He was probably a controversial figure on his campus. I mean, that's probably no surprise to people. But he would have been marked as just kind of a perennial candidate if he had lost in 1978. I don't think he would have gotten elected on his fourth try. So he was kind of down to his last out in 1978, when he got in there. And he had tried on, before he got to the Congress in 1978, he had tried on a number of different kind of political identities. If you go way back in time, the term Rockefeller Republican, Nelson Rockefeller, he was a liberal Republican. Today, in this day and age, somebody like Nelson Rockefeller, he was the governor of New York in the 1960s. He ran for president several times, most notably against Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative. In 1964, they ran for the Republican nomination. Nelson Rockefeller was the old liberal wing of the Republican Party. He would be a Democrat today. Gingrich, initially, young Newt Gingrich, aligned himself with Nelson Rockefeller. He aligned himself with the liberal wing of the Republican Party against Barry Goldwater in the rising wing of the Republican Party in the early 1970s, when there was the movement, the ecology movement was really taking hold in the country. Remember, Earth Day didn't come around until the early 1970s. Gingrich positioned himself as an environmentalist, liberal Republican environmentalist. What he really was, and it took researching this book for me to figure this out, is what Newt Gingrich really is, I think, beyond ideology, is he is fascinated with populism and the power of populism. And what he, I think, has always been trying to find and to tap into is, in any given moment, on any given issue, in any given political or historical scenario, where is the populist current? Where is the populist vein? And that's taken him, I think he was looking for it sort of more in the middle, and even in some cases on the left side of the political spectrum in his early days. And it kind of came around. And one of the things that came around for him when he got elected to Congress for the first time in 1978 was taxes. There was a tax revolt brewing in this country in the late 1970s. California famously in 1978, just months before Newt Gingrich won his House seat, California passed Proposition 13. There was this full-fledged, and it was shocking to the political class, tax revolt in California in 1978. Gingrich saw that, and he honed in on it right away. And there was a movement. It was being led at the time nationally by Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp, the former Buffalo Bill quarterback who had gone to Congress. Jack Kemp was in Congress in the 70s, and he was pushing for basically a national version of what happened in California, a sweeping, massive, unheard of tax cut plan. Gingrich saw what happened in California, immediately said, hey, elect me to the Congress. I'm going to sign on with Jack Kemp. I'm going to lead the charge. We're going to do this nationally. So Kemp was the original leader. Gingrich down in Georgia says, sign me up. The other guy who says, sign me up, is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's about to run for president in 1980. This would be Reagan's third run for president. He had narrowly lost to Gerald Ford, sitting president in the 1976 primaries. So that was sort of Gingrich's entree into the right as we now know it. But it was in search of populism. That was the thing he was always trying to find.
And do you think it's fair to say that without Newt Gingrich, we wouldn't have Donald Trump?
And it's interesting because what I try to chart in the book then is the long journey for Newt from, the sort of gadfly political figure to the guy that breaks the permanent Democratic Congress and becomes a Republican House Speaker. And it's interesting when you look at it, what he did, it was two things. It was the attempt to find that populist nerve. And it was the use of media and technology to kind of, when he thought he had found something to really play up, he would use media. So a great example of this is when he gets elected to Congress, he comes in January 79. That is when cameras go on for the first time. They have cameras turned on in the House of Representatives. C-SPAN, the cable channel, was created to do gavel-to-gavel coverage of the House. Before that, there was no such thing as a television camera in the House of Representatives. It arrives when Newt Gingrich arrives. And his basic philosophy was, We need to have a contrast with the Democrats, basically treat the House like a TV show. Everything is being beamed across the country. Anybody tuning in on this new thing called cable television can tune into the House at any given time. And the mission of Republicans, this was radical stuff, just institutionally. The mission of Republicans should be that any viewer tuning in at any minute on C-SPAN, if they see a Republican on their screen, the Republican is demonstrating for them rhetorically, tactically. The Republican is demonstrating the difference between Republicans and Democrats. Always have a contrast, always be in opposition to the Democrats, always be taking the opportunity to make the Democrats the party, of elitism, the party of liberalism gone, So I think back to what Newt was doing with C-SPAN and just those cameras. It's primitive technology compared to what we have right now. But I think back to that, and then I think to what Donald Trump did with Twitter, and I see a parallel there, where it was an opportunity to go around the existing media. The existing media infrastructure was much narrower, much more limited in the 70s and early 80s, but Newt found a way around it to go directly to an audience with C-SPAN. And Trump, 2016, really his whole presidency till the very end, found a way around that too with Twitter.
We actually have a comment in the chat that actually leads into a question I was going to ask as well, which is from Chris Wiegard, who says that he associates Gingrich with the politics of grievance and resentment. And I was going to ask you, how much of that Republican populism as espoused by Gingrich and since then espoused by Trump and others, how much does it really have to do with ideology, which, that conservative ideology, what even is it anymore? It literally was, they couldn't even articulate it. They couldn't even come up with a platform in 2020. And so how much is ideology? How much of it is this sort of just raw grievance, almost an emotional response? Or is it race resentment, class resentment, or some combination? Where's that coming from?
Yeah, I think the Gingrich theory of politics and what motivated him too was the idea that there was this, and this had really been, I think, in his view, I don't want to say created by, but sort of almost institutionalized by the 1960s, by the sort of cultural upheaval of the 1960s, that there was this arrogant, out of touch liberal elite that was driving culture and politics of the country. And that there was, to take a term from the Nixon days, that there was a silent majority out there bristling with resentment of this cultural elite and looking for a vehicle. And so when I say he was fascinated by populism, I think that's what he was trying to tap into. What he really did, what he looked at was, I say Nixon and the silent majority. Take the 1972 election, when Richard Nixon got reelected, he got 61% of the vote against the most liberal Democrat ever nominated, George McGovern. It was one of the all-time landslides in American political history. And yet at the same time, the Republican president is winning 49 of 50 states, 61% of the national popular vote. And yet at the same time, Democrats walk away with that election with a 75-seat majority in the House of Representatives and nearly 60 seats in the U.S. Senate. And what Newt Gingrich, what he basically said was, we need to and we can make what happened in the presidential race happen in congressional races and Senate races around the country. We want everybody looking in their backyard at their Democratic member of Congress, their Democratic senator. We want them everywhere in the country to see not an individual Democrat, but George McGovern. Because if we make them see George McGovern, they will turn against them. And that was what animated it.
Well, before we take things up closer to the present and to your work as a journalist, I also want to talk about the other side, what's going on in a Democratic realignment. And actually, the last sort of image of your book is Bill and Hillary Clinton at the end of his presidency. Instead of going home to Little Rock, Arkansas, they moved to Chappaqua, New York, which, as you know, is a sort of a wealthy, liberal, suburban enclave of New York City. And you have this as kind of a symbol of a shift within the Democratic Party. And I wonder if you could talk about that and about Clinton's role in that shift.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, and that's the other piece of this. And I mentioned, if you think about it in the big picture, the Democratic Party, a different version of the Democratic Party, but just the Democratic Party in name, dominated the South for a century, really, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. And again, this was a very conservative Democratic Party. There's a lot of historical shifting that happened there. But what it did, though, that domination, it lingered, or at least the thought of it lingered. So Democrats, through the 70s, 80s, into the 90s with Clinton, still had this vision of restoring, if not the entire South, at least making dramatic inroads and winning Southern states. And they had it. Look, Jimmy Carter, 1976, Southerner, wins, sweeps the South, gets the presidency. Mondale, Dukakis are the two Democratic candidates in the 80s from, Northern liberals. They get slaughtered. Bill Clinton comes in 92, picks a fellow Southerner, Al Gore from Tennessee, as his running mate. Again, they won. They didn't sweep the South, but they made inroads in the South. They won handily nationally. So there was this sense that, hey, if this is the way Democrats have to do it. At the start of the 90s, there was a sense that, hey, this is the way Democrats have to do it if they're going to be viable nationally. But all of the upheaval, the Bill Clinton versus Newt Gingrich drama, the 90s, the Clinton impeachment, Clinton's tax hikes, Hillary Clinton's push for national health care, gays in the military debate, gun control becoming a front and center item there for Democrats' agenda item. All of this works itself out, where, as I said, once you get to 2000, you've got the Democrats unable to win a single Southern state. And this is with somebody from Tennessee at the top of the ticket. In fact, if Al Gore had just carried his home state of Tennessee in 2000, he's the president. It doesn't come down to a Florida recount. All he had to do is carry something. He couldn't even carry Tennessee. Arkansas, the Clinton state, didn't go for Al Gore in 2000 either. It went pretty decisively for George W. Bush. All of the South. And yet, the other thing Democrats took from 2000 was, even without a single Southern state, we got 267 electoral votes. We won the popular vote. The Democrats had replaced a lot of what they were looking for the South to generate for them. They had replaced it with strength in suburban areas in the North and the Midwest, on the Pacific Coast. And they saw the future of their party there. And so when I put that in there about Bill and Hillary Clinton at the end, it was sort of that recognition that I think they had, and I think more broadly their party had coming out of 2000, that, hey, the opportunity to win in the future, it's not the man from Hope.
Yeah.
It's the woman from Chappaqua.
Right. So taking things sort of forward toward the present, it's funny for me, having been, a young adult. I was in my 20s. My 20s basically tracked with the 1990s, and I'm 50 now. It all feels like very recent history to me. But then reading your book, I realized how ancient and what a distant world the 90s were in so many ways. And starting with when you spoke a few minutes ago about that depiction of the red and blue states on election night 2000. And you also describe Tim Russert standing there on NBC with a pair of dry erase boards on election night. It's like, wait, there were dry erase boards on TV on election night 20 years ago. And it really brought home for me the technological changes in the past 20 years. And the internet was in its infancy at the end of your story in 2000. And how has all of that changed? How is the story developed as technology has changed in those 20 years since the story that you tell?
Yeah, it's funny. I say that the red and blue as sort of political terms didn't exist before 2000. The earliest reference I can find, media reference, was October 26th, 2000. It was Tim Russert on the Today Show doing an election preview. And yeah, it wasn't a whiteboard, but what they had back then was one of the walls in the studio was just a giant map with tiles. And you put up the tile. This is only 20 years ago.
Wow.
The tile, the red tile or the blue tile, depending on how you thought the state would go. I don't know. I kind of think that's cool. I wouldn't mind trying that sometime. See how that goes on an election night. But yeah, when you talk about the internet and social media in particular, it's an essential part of the story. And I think the big picture thing that's happened, not just in the last 20 years, but really, I'd say go back to the 70s, the last 50 years or so, has been that the nationalization of our media. And so you mentioned like a C-SPAN, not that C-SPAN has ever had blockbuster ratings, but there it was, an ability to get, a singular message out nationally at the same time. Cable television really began to allow for this because, pre-cable television, if you wanted any kind of political news through the television, it was basically 22 minutes a night of national broadcast news. And I love going through the archives here at NBC. If you go back and you watch like the broadcast NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News from say like 1971, 14 of those 22 minutes were going to be a foreign policy story. Major election stories that you will see right now on cable news, 6-8 hours a day, sometimes didn't even get mentioned, might have got 30 seconds. That was it. So the shift to cable television, CNN was launched in 1980. It was a few years later, 15 years later, that you got a Fox News and an MSNBC. But really, the launch of cable news first, the launch of a C-SPAN, started to really nationalize the political conversation. Then the internet, and then social media comes in and personalizes. It takes the nationalization and it personalizes it. And I think what's been achieved there, it's a bit of what the Gingrich vision was, but what both parties have found is that it works for them nationally, because what it means is it flattens out so many of the sort of regional differences that used to define our politics. It really does mean whether you're in Chestertown, Maryland, Little Rock, Arkansas, Modesto, California, Groton, Massachusetts, wherever you are, increasingly, we are all viewing the same story. Now, it's being told differently. We will choose the narrators, but we're all consuming a national political narrative. We're choosing to consume a blue national political narrative or a red national political narrative. You're losing that thing in the middle that used to be there, used to define sort of coverage, but it's national. There was, I think this is in the book, and if it's not, it's something I say all the time. The Speaker of the House who Newt Gingrich went toe-to-toe with in the 1980s and really helped build his rise by having conflict with was Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill, an old school North Cambridge, Massachusetts, Irish-American pol, who came of age, in the time of ward healers and political machines. His saying, his best-selling book, was all politics is local. Absolutely not true anymore. All politics is national now. The days of all politics is local are obsolete. And I mean, we see that just statistically. You can look at the election results in 2020. You can look at any election result of the last couple decades. More and more, everybody is voting a straight ticket. Where they side nationally in the presidential race trickles all the way down the ballot. They vote Democratic in the presidential election, or they're voting Democratic for Senate and for the House and for governor and for state legislature and for county office. They go straight ticket voting. It has never been more uniform statistically than it is now. But you just don't have those. Again, a generation or two ago, it was very, very common to vote for one party's candidate for president, vote for the other one for the U.S. Senate because you liked, hey, bring money home. That stuff doesn't fly anymore. And I think the nationalization and the personalization of our media have really driven that.
Yeah, and you were talking about we're all kind of following the same narratives, but we're choosing our narrators. And that choosing our narrators seems to be almost more important than following the same narratives, at least to me. That phrase that Kellyanne Conway used literally 2 days into the Trump administration, alternative facts. It's come to seem like that is certainly the phrase of the past 4 years, possibly the phrase of the century, or even the phrase of the millennium. God help us. It just seems to describe so much about this country where people can just inhabit these hermetically sealed bubbles of what they believe reality to be. And it must be very challenging for you as a journalist to work within that environment, and the environment of the rise of Newsmax and One America News. What's that like for you to be working in this sort of post-factual environment?
Well, personally, for me, I what I hope and what I aim for is to inhabit an island where there is still an audience that can cut across those lines, because especially by covering elections, election results, the run up to elections. I mean, ultimately, whatever side you're on, whatever political tribe you belong to, you care about who wins, who loses the election, who looks like they're going to win, who looks like they're going to lose the election, and why, what seems to be working for one candidate, what doesn't seem to be working for another candidate. That sort of conversation, that sort of information. I found that whether it's in a setting like this or where it's, talking more directly to a group or being on air. But I found that there's a high interest level and receptiveness to that kind of conversation that still cuts across party lines. So at least from my small island in a gigantic ocean, it still seems possible.
And I think one of the great things for those of us, and I was one of those who was glued to your coverage during election week. I'm not just saying that now because you're our guest. I really was, and it felt like we were kind of with you on this little island of facts and figures. And so many of us, and I know this is a question you've gotten asked a lot probably, but so many of us were just amazed watching you there with this seemingly inexhaustible command of facts and figures at your disposal. And also during the Georgia runoff elections, I never thought I would know the names of so many counties in Georgia as you familiarized me with that day. And, and watching you were playing that famous big board like Yo-Yo Ma with his cello. I mean, it was a beautiful thing to watch. And so, how do you do what you do? Because you're not working from cue cards when you do that. It is just coming, from brain to mouth and to hand. And what kind of preparation goes into that? And you clearly love what you do. At least it looks either that or you're doing a really good job of faking it. But tell us kind of what's going on behind the scenes and in your head.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, I've always loved election nights, just sort of as a I guess as a spectacle, as a ritual. They used to be in the earlier years that I followed them. They used to be a little bit more orderly, just in terms of getting results out. I mean, we're now in an era, obviously, even before COVID. We've been shifting to a lot more kind of early spread out voting, different voting methodologies. In a lot of cases, a lot of states, a lot of counties within states, the administrative and the bureaucratic features needed to accommodate these shifts in voting haven't really kept up, and it's resulted in, and we certainly saw this back in November, it's resulted in many cases in long delays and some confusion just in terms of getting results out. So it's become much more of an extended process and a complicated process in terms of just trying to make sense of votes as they come in, because when votes come in now, and again, COVID just took this to a level 3,000. But when votes come in now, as opposed to, let's say, 10 years ago, when I'm watching a Georgia, for a runoff, it's no longer just, okay, Cobb County, we just got votes in, from Cobb County. And I know, okay, Cobb County, Atlanta suburbs. 10 years ago, I would have been saying big Republican suburb. Now I'd be saying Democratic suburb. But I'd have an estimate in my mind right away, like, okay, to be having a good night, the Democrats need to be at X% in Cobb County. Let's take a look. They're 2 points short, or they're 5 points over. And you got to benchmark. And again, even just 10 years ago, it would be that straightforward. Now, the challenge is when you get votes in from Cobb County, okay, what type of vote am I looking at? What bucket are these votes from? Because there's 3 buckets really, and this is going to vary by state, but Georgia and a lot of states now have this 3 buckets. Number one is they are mail ballots, cast by mail. Those are overwhelmingly, we're talking like 4-1, 5-1 Democratic. So if I'm looking at, it's usually, given that it's that significant, it's usually pretty easy to tell when you have mail ballots. But still, key question there. Are they early in-person votes? That's another huge category. People who went and voted at the polls, but they did it a week ahead of time, a weekend ahead of time. That is still going to skew Democratic, but it's going to be less dramatically Democratic. And then, are they votes that were cast in person on election day? That is, at least in this moment in our history, that's an overwhelmingly Republican sample. So it's trying to figure out which sample you're looking at. Is it a mix of samples? How many ballots from this group have now been counted versus how many are still outstanding from that group? That's the ball game increasingly. So it's no longer just knowing the county, it's knowing that process, knowing that procedure, and it's just the preparation for it is just in terms of the counties, it's just memorizing, repetition, studying, staring at a map over and over and over again. And in terms of the process, it's just, talking to the counties as much as you can ahead of time, really trying to have a sense from them what they expect to be the case. And then what's that line? Was it Mike Tyson who said everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, and that usually happens at about 7:15 on election night. So,
well, the research you do is really just prodigious, and I wonder, you just in the past minute or so mentioned baseball, you've mentioned boxing, and you've got this passion for sports as well, which is also, of course, a matter of numbers in a certain sense. So are you somebody who's always loved numbers? Were you that kid in the front row in math class? Were you the kid in the front row in history class, or both? I'd love to know, sort of, is this part of a lifelong passion for you?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is yes. On numbers, I've always been, I've always, it's always been useful just for me to understand something if I can put a number on it and just, compare. So I was always good with, like, I don't want to say I was a good math student, because I was terrible when it came to any of the geometry, trigonometry, calculus. I remember I took this, they put me in a calculus class in high school. It was the AP calculus class, and the teacher would brag that nobody in her 20 years of teaching had gotten below a 3 or something on this test, and I got a 1, which is the worst possible. So I destroyed her ability to. I feel guilty about it to this day, but I was just terrible at it. I still cone, volume, sphere. I can't. My mind doesn't work that way. But on simple, raw, like computational math, that's where I've always, just for whatever reason, I've had a facility for it as far back as I can remember. It's always been easy for me to memorize numbers. It's always easy for me to understand something when I can compare numbers. So that whatever that is has always kind of lent itself to this.
Well, I have so many questions that I'd love to ask you. I want to give other people a chance to ask questions, though. I'll ask you one more quick question before I start sharing others' questions, and that is it true that your khakis from election week are going into the Smithsonian?
Oh, I don't.
Famous Gap khakis.
They had talk about things you never see coming. They had reached out with some interest, but so I don't know what the latest on that is. I know we had a little bit of back and forth with them. They may have moved on to more important things.
And I read somewhere that sales of Gap khakis spiked that week. So I hope that Gap has given you like a lifetime supply of free khakis or something like that.
I got 4 pairs already, so I'm set for 10 years at least.
Good. Yeah, they're indestructible, aren't they? Well, I'm going to start asking other folks for questions. And I know that in a conversation like this, a lot of people will have political opinions of their own that they are eager to share at some length, shall we say. So I will ask for folks raising their hands to actually speak. You need to promise to keep your question, to make it actually a question, and keep it to 2 sentences or less. Those of you with longer comments and questions, I will be looking for them in the chat and doing my best to condense those and share them with Steve. So let's go ahead. And I don't actually, let me put us in gallery view for me here. I don't see any hands up yet. Oh, we do have some hands up. And Dan Gorman will take a question.
Thank you. As the interloping non-Washington College student, I'm getting my PhD in U.S. history, and I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about your research process, the kinds of sources you've drawn on to do your work, because you've always struck me as one of the more, let's say, academic TV journalists.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll tell you one thing that just helped immeasurably. I feel like I was cheating on this. That just helped immeasurably for this for research was, I'm at my desk right now, access to the NBC's archives, which there's a television news archive at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where they've recorded all or close to all of the network newscasts going back to basically the advent of network television, and they've thrown in a lot of cable news through. I got that right here. So that was a hugely helpful source that, again, like if I had an hour or two, during the day, or just staying after my, normal day was done, I could just knock that off, here and there in bits and pieces. Whereas, like, I think if I didn't have access to that, I would have had to book a trip down to Nashville, try to get as much as I could in, in a couple days. I'm sure missed a ton. So it was just, the period of time I was writing about really is, I would say, broadly speaking, if you want to call it the cable news era. And so it was, I remember I found this clip. C-SPAN had its 40th anniversary right after my book came out. I say 79 C-SPAN went on the air, so this is 2019. And I remember I had found this clip in the research of a 1984 NBC Nightly News piece on how Newt Gingrich's use of this little known obscure cable channel called C-SPAN was causing upheaval in Congress. And, Tom Brokaw introduces the piece. Chris Wallace, who's now Fox News Channel or Fox News Sunday host, he was an NBC News correspondent in the 1980s. He reports it. And I got the clip over to the folks at C-SPAN, and they loved it. And Brian Lamb, who was C-SPAN's founder, and he still has, I think, like an emeritus role there. He saw it and had, it was the first time he'd seen this thing in 35 years, and it was a nice trip down memory lane. But yeah, that sort of thing I was just able to dig up here, really easily. And again, that's just thanks to having this role here.
So we've got a really an interesting and important comment from Melissa Deckman, who's the chair of the political science department at Washington College. And she notes the demographic race, as she calls it, that's going on, where there's an ever shrinking share of the electorate and of the population that's white. And she suggests that the GOP is going to become a permanent minority party, given both the changing racial and ethnic makeup of the country and the tendencies of younger Americans. Do you think that's possible, that there will be this permanent minority status for the GOP unless they sort of reform their ways?
I think the track record of voting, of betting on a party being a permanent minority party is not good in our political history. I think parties tend to evolve, but also electorates tend to evolve in unpredictable ways. And I do think, I know this theory is this. I say theory. There was a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority that came out, I think, 20 years ago. Early in the George W. Bush's first term as president, that basically made the argument articulated in the question here that there was a rising younger, more liberal, culturally liberal, younger demographic combined with a non-white share of the population that was going to increase 2 points every presidential election, and it has for 2 decades now. It has. And that this was going to, render the Republican Party as we knew it obsolete. So far, it hasn't. It certainly has a huge impact on our politics, but I think we've seen in some ways the electorate has evolved in some unpredictable ways. I'll give you one example of that. Just take a look at the 2020 results. Now, the Democrats won. Biden 7 million more votes than Trump in the popular vote, and 306 electoral votes. So it's a Democratic victory. But the shift in the electorate relative to 2016 that really powered the Biden win was not non-white voters. The shift was actually among white voters. And more specifically, it's that there's a class divide that's become much more pronounced within that white demographic, and that is the white college, non-college split. And basically one group, white voters with a college degree, and I make no judgment on one as being, this is just something you can see in the polling. White voters with a college degree have moved dramatically over the last couple of decades, and especially since Donald Trump's rise about 5 years ago, have moved dramatically in the Democratic direction. I mentioned like Cobb County a minute ago, Cobb County right outside Atlanta in Georgia, right through George W. Bush's presidency. This is a place where Republicans would routinely get 65% of the vote. Democrats are now winning it by double digits. It's changed that dramatically, that quickly. Densely populated metro area, high concentration of white voters with a college degree. That's where you've seen the most dramatic movement. The non-white movement from 2016 to 2020 actually worked in the other direction. Donald Trump did better, and I don't want to overstate. We're not talking about like winning the he lost the non-white vote by a very wide margin, but he didn't lose it by as wide a margin in 2020 as he did in 2016. And there was particular movement among Hispanic voters. And the movement among Hispanic voters, I would describe as dramatic, especially in places like South Florida and along the US-Mexico border, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And I would add to that we saw, this is a burgeoning non-white demographic group that we don't have a great sort of data-based political history of, because it just hasn't been large enough in the past, but it's getting there, and that's Asian American voters. And I think there was also something close to, and we got to get some more numbers back on this. This takes some time sometimes, but I think there was something close to dramatic movement, again, away from Democrats toward Trump among Asian American voters, particularly in Orange County, California. And Orange County, California is where Republicans actually did surprisingly well in House elections, flipped a couple House seats away from Democrats in 2020. Total surprises. So I don't know if that is foreshadowing a trend, if that's foreshadowing some kind of a shift here. But I do think there are versions of this sort of political demographic evolution that will defy conventional wisdom. Where you could have a shift where there are the same kinds of divisions we're talking about emerging among white voters, a college, non-college divide, a class-based divide, that kind of thing. Do those start to show up? They haven't yet, but do they start to show up among non-white voters? Is there a gender divide that starts to show up among non-white voters, as you really see among white voters? I think there are I say it only this way, the history of these evolutions, these demographic evolutions in our politics, they never go quite as expected. And there are always surprises. And so to me, it's always be aware of what some of the potential surprises are, and don't bet on a party being a permanent minority party, because it just, our history shows that doesn't really happen.
Yeah, I think it's a lesson for all of us who study history as well. The one thing that you learn from being a historian is that whatever we think the future is going to be, it's not going to be that. Okay, we have a bunch of questions coming in from Washington College students, to whom I always like to give priority, even priority over the Washington College board member who is also asking a question. Beth Lehman, we will come to you. But first we're going to go to Charles Snyder, who it looks like is coming to us live from his Washington College dorm room. I recognize that dorm issue furniture in the background. Charles, what have you got to ask?
So I was just kind of wondering, so you were talking earlier about how people are choosing their narrators going over the same stories. So I was just kind of wondering how, like with QAnon and sort of these other, like these opportunities for people to essentially become their own narrators and basically search out their own information and have like these very decentralized storytellers. How does that differ from, say, going against the same sort of thing if it was coming from an organized news network or an organization that has a very clear head and person directing the whole story and movement as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it is like, I think there's like two almost contradictory things that are going on here, where it's like everything is becoming much less centralized. And there are just the evolution of our media technology does allow for, first of all, it just allows for a lot more voices in general. But it allows for, people without any traditional credentials, and in some cases, it allows for stuff like you're talking about to really kind of get a wider audience than it would have had in the past, because there's just a lot of these gatekeeping roles that were performed by major media institutions in the past. Just they can't do it anymore just because of the nature of media. But at the same time, all of the sort of or most, it seems, of the sort of energy that's being created by this seems to be directing people in very, very strictly partisan and tribal ways. Like I said, when you just measure partisanship, when you measure, there aren't a lot of cross currents here. You can kind of look at, after a period of time, you can kind of look at any new voice and say, well, this is basically now aligned with Team Red, and or this is basically now aligned with Team Blue. And these audiences, when you measure them, really still reflect deep partisanship one way or the other.
We have a question from another student, Leah Morris, a Starr Center intern, and she asks what effect the red-blue divide has on our government, and including on parts of the government that are supposed to be separate from politics, like the judicial branch of our federal government.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's another one there where I think, I say the 2000 election, the kind of, the title of the book draws inspiration from. I say it was a Supreme Court ruling that ended the recount in Florida and made George W. Bush president back in December of 2000. And at the time, there was a lot of concern about, had the court stepped into something in a way, because it was basically the Republican appointed justices on the court, minus John Paul Stevens, who'd been appointed by Gerald Ford, but otherwise the Republican appointed justices on the court voted for the argument that made Bush president, and the Democratic appointed justices on the court voted for the argument that might have kept that from happening, or at least prolonged the possibility of Al Gore becoming president. There was a lot of concern coming out of that, hey, the Supreme Court had this impeccable, above politics reputation, and was that going to start to take a hit? If you look at the polling on it, a generation later, and I think a lot of this has to do just with every Supreme Court nomination now, we immediately talk about, like, is the court about to take a huge shift one way or the other? And you look at how partisan the Senate votes have gotten for those. There seems to be, when you poll it now, just a broad kind of, I don't know if acceptance is the word, but just a sense that, of course, it's partisan. And that's a major change from it was the possibility that people would think that a generation ago was considered deeply, deeply concerning. And now it seems that's how people see it. And maybe you think that's just an accurate measure of it, but that's a big change.
So we'll take a couple more questions, and Beth Lehman, Washington College trustee emerita, has been waiting patiently. So Beth, you're up. And you're muted.
Thank you. So I was wondering, Steve, about can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I got you.
Oh, our internet died.
No, we can hear you.
So I was wondering more. Okay, I was wondering more about your prognosis for the impact of the Electoral College. Clearly, what it has done in the 2016 election was, in my opinion, bad. But where do we go? Because there seems to be such a skew toward how the Electoral College is formed that it's going to have impact beyond the popular vote for a long time.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, it's look at it this way. The big picture view on this is, I can remember the run up to the 2000 election, Gore Bush, and it's, close election. And there was actually a sense running up to 2000 that Bush's strength was in the popular vote. He led, if you go back and look, George W. Bush led just about all the polling in the run up to the election day in 2000. And the Democratic strength was going to be in the Electoral College. And I show people this article sometimes. There was an article, it was cited sources, so you don't have anybody from the Bush campaign's name on it. But it was about a week before the 2000 election, with the Bush campaign laying out its plan for what happens if Bush wins the popular vote and Al Gore wins the Electoral College. And it talked about fighting the result and, trying to recruit electors, to say Democrats for democracy. And the thing was, in 2000, the idea that there'd be a split had been untested for more than a century. At that point, you had to go back to the 19th century to find the last divergence between the Electoral College and the popular vote. And it is hard to believe now, but there really was, in the political class, there really was a sense that, like, hey, if this ever happens, this might be a really big deal. We don't know how people are going to take this. And I think the interesting thing that happened in 2000 is the fact of the split. Now, remember, Al Gore won 600,000 more votes in the popular vote than George W. Bush, but George W. Bush became president because of the 271-267 Electoral College. The fact of that 600,000 vote split in the popular vote was an afterthought in 2000 because the drama in Florida, the state being called first for Al Gore early in the night, then pulled back, then called for George W. Bush, and the presidency called for Bush. Then that was pulled back, and then the presidency call was pulled back, and then we went into a 36-day recount, and there were court proceedings and hanging chads, and the Supreme Court stepped in. All of that drama was all anybody talked about, really in the 6 weeks after the 2000 election. And the fact that Gore had won the popular vote, it was known, but there was so much suspense over who's going to call Florida. How was the court going to? That became the story. And so in my mind, it's an interesting thing still, because I still wonder what would have happened in 2000 if it had been clean, if election night had been clean, and it was clear that night that George W. Bush was going to be president by a 271-267 count in the Electoral College, and Al Gore was going to win the popular vote by more than 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush. I still wonder, for the first time in more than a century, how that would have been handled. But it was kind of an afterthought. It kind of happened. Bush became president, and we okay, well, that's what we do. That's what we do when there's a split. So, you had it then in 2016, didn't have it in 2020, although I would note a shift of a cumulative total of 44,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona would have reelected Donald Trump. So Trump got almost 8 million fewer popular votes than Joe Biden in 2020, but 44,000, a shift of 44,000 in those 3 states, Trump gets reelected. So it would have been an even bigger split than you had in 2016. I think it's clear that the way the demographics have shaken out in the Trump era give the Republicans a clear, obvious advantage in the Electoral College. I don't think it's clear that that's going to be sustained or sustainable for them, because Trump did. I say we've had a basic divide that was set in 2000, and that's true. But Trump did tap into. He exacerbated it in some ways. He brought out, true on both sides, but he brought out voters, I think especially on his side, who hadn't really participated before, that really drove up his strength. I think this is especially true in the upper Midwest. That's really where you saw extra strength for Trump relative to any other Republican. I could think back to 2004. George W. Bush got reelected, winning the national popular vote by 3 points over Al Gore. But a switch of 60,000 votes in Ohio, Al Gore, John Kerry, but a switch of 60,000 votes in Ohio in 2004 would have made Kerry president. So the Democrats actually in 2004 had the advantage in the Electoral College. In 2012, this is another one I love to show people, is totally forgotten. The advantage for Obama, there were long chunks of the 2012 campaign where Mitt Romney led in the polls nationally. What was supposed to save Obama in 2012 was what they used to call the blue wall, this collection of states adding up to an Electoral College majority that had been with the Democrats in just about every election since 1992. It didn't end up working out that way. Obviously, Obama got the popular vote in the Electoral College. I say it, though, as a reminder that pre-Trump, the question of which party had an Electoral College advantage was very much disputed. And I think you could make a case coming right into the 2016 election that the Democrats, despite losing it in 2000, had the advantage in 2004 and had the advantage in 2012. Now we look at it and we say, clearly Trump, the math of the Electoral College worked in Trump's benefit. Post-Trump, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I cite 2004 and 2012 as a reminder that it can change more than we realize.
Unpredictability, again, about trying to predict the future. Well, I can't resist asking you one more question about 2020. But first, a piece of business or an announcement, which is that Steve has really generously agreed to talk to some Washington College students after the big event ends. So my colleague Casey is going to share a link to this special after party in the comments here in the chat. And it is an exclusive students only after party. So honor system, if you are not a Washington College student, we trust you not to click on that link when this event is over. But if you are a Washington College student, and I see some of our student journalists here in particular, please join us for a little private chat with Steve after the big event is over. So Steve, coming back to 2020, I want to ask you, when you were up there on the night of November 3rd, could you have imagined what we would then see on the day of January 6th?
No, I was up there on January 5th and I couldn't imagine it. You know, in fact, I was at noon on January 6th. One of the two Senate races in Georgia was still technically not called. John Ossoff, the Democrat who beat David Perdue, the Republican incumbent, it was clear where it was going to go. But I remember I was in the studio in position, you know, basically just to camp out for the afternoon, because it was, okay, at some point this afternoon, we're going to get enough votes in from Georgia to call this race. You know, obviously big moment. Democrats get both Senate seats in Georgia. Democrats would then have control of the Senate, and Biden would get exactly what he was hoping to have coming into his presidency, the House, the Senate. This was going to be the big story at some point on the afternoon of January 6th. And I was ready to stand there and take folks through it. And yeah, I remember about 1:32 in the afternoon, whenever exactly it was, just watching pictures coming out of there. I stepped away and just called the producer in the control room. And I said, look, you've got me here to tell the story of who's going to have political control of the U.S. Senate. Your story on the air is who's going to have physical control of the U.S. Senate chamber. Maybe that's the more pressing thing right now. And I just became, I think, what everybody else was at that point, just a viewer, just a spectator trying to figure it out and make sense of it. So, you know, no, I don't think in all my years of watching elections and seeing some wild things, you know, the 2000 election, I just went, no, never imagined seeing anything like that.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and thanks for all of you who have joined us tonight. I wish we could keep talking. It's been great seeing the sort of parallel conversation that's going on in the chat, and I hope we'll continue. Conversations will continue, I'm sure, to be inspired by the things that you've shared with us tonight, Steve. So now is a time when our students can start clicking on the link for that exclusive after party that's in the chat. And thank you, and good night, everybody. And we hope to see you next week at another edition of Thursdays with the Starr Center, which is actually about the demographic shift that we were talking about earlier, and specifically the changing demographics of our own Eastern Shore of Maryland. So please come and join us for that. See you soon, and have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.